Sheriff Daniel Cross found the first body hanging from a tree in Mercy Hollow on a Tuesday morning, and he knew immediately that his quiet retirement plan had just died alongside whoever was swinging from that rope. The corpse belonged to Raymond Butler, a well-respected deacon at First Baptist Church and a man who had lived in the small Appalachian town of Harlan's Ridge for 63 years without causing anyone a moment of trouble. Or so everyone had believed until Daniel cut him down and found the photographs in Raymond's pockets, dozens of Polaroids showing children in poses that made Daniel's stomach turn and his hands shake with rage he had not felt since his days as a young deputy decades ago. Daniel had been sheriff of Harlan's Ridge for 28 years. He had seen his share of darkness in those years: domestic violence, drug overdoses, the occasional bar fight that ended in death. But this was different. This was evil that had been hiding in plain sight, wrapped in Sunday suits and handshake smiles. Daniel stood in that hollow staring at the dead man and the photographs scattered on the ground around him, and he understood that his entire understanding of his town was about to be shattered. Raymond Butler had not killed himself out of guilt or shame. Someone had executed him and staged it to look like suicide. Someone knew what Raymond had been doing and had decided to become judge, jury, and executioner. The question that haunted Daniel as he called for backup and secured the scene was simple but terrible. How many others knew about Raymond's crimes? And more importantly, how many others had been involved? Daniel had learned over his long career that predators like Raymond rarely operated alone. They formed networks, shared their victims, protected each other through silence and mutual blackmail. If Raymond was part of such a network in Harlan's Ridge, then the person who killed him might be working through a list. There might be more bodies coming. There might be more secrets buried so deep in this town that exposing them would tear the community apart. Daniel's deputy, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, arrived at the scene within 20 minutes. She was the daughter of Daniel's closest friend and had grown up in Harlan's Ridge. She knew everyone in town, and they knew her. When Sarah saw the photographs, her face went pale, and she had to step away to vomit in the bushes. Daniel understood. There was knowing that evil existed in the world, and then there was seeing photographic evidence of that evil committed against children you had watched grow up. Some of those children in the photographs were now adults living ordinary lives in Harlan's Ridge. Some of them probably had no memory of what had been done to them, their young minds mercifully blocking out the trauma. Others surely carried the scars every day. Daniel made the decision right there in Mercy Hollow to keep the photographs secret. If the town learned what Raymond Butler had been, there would be chaos. Families would tear themselves apart, wondering if their children had been victims. Vigilante justice would spread like wildfire. More importantly, if Raymond's death was connected to his crimes, and Daniel was certain it was, then releasing information about the photographs might warn other members of the network that someone was hunting them. Daniel wanted whoever was doing this to continue. He wanted them to lead him to every single person involved in hurting children. Then, and only then, would he decide what to do with that information. The official story Daniel released to the town was that Raymond Butler had died by suicide due to undisclosed personal struggles. The photographs were logged as evidence, but their contents were described only as sensitive materials under investigation. Daniel's superiors at the county level accepted this explanation without pressing for details. They trusted Daniel's judgment and did not want to deal with the political nightmare that would come from exposing a beloved church deacon as a child predator. Daniel felt sick cooperating in a cover-up, but he told himself it was temporary. Once he knew the full scope of the network, he would bring everything into the light. Until then, silence served his investigation better than transparency. Daniel began digging into Raymond Butler's life with methodical care. He examined phone records, bank statements, travel patterns, and social connections. Raymond was a creature of habit who rarely left Harlan's Ridge except for monthly trips to a cabin he owned in the next county over. Daniel drove out to that cabin and found it had been cleaned recently, too thoroughly. Someone had scrubbed the place down with bleach. Daniel found hair and fiber evidence anyway because amateurs always missed something. He sent the samples to the state crime lab and requested expedited processing. He lied and said it was connected to a drug investigation to avoid drawing attention to the real nature of his inquiry. While waiting for lab results, Daniel started mapping Raymond's social connections. He created a chart showing everyone Raymond interacted with regularly: church members, fishing buddies, people he did business with. The chart grew large and complicated quickly because Raymond had lived in Harlan's Ridge his entire life and knew virtually everyone. Daniel looked for patterns. He looked for other men who had access to children through positions of trust. He looked for anyone else who made regular trips out of town that could not be easily explained. The work was tedious and disturbing. Daniel found himself suspecting people he had known for decades, people whose children had played with his own children when they were young. 3 weeks after finding Raymond's body, Daniel got a call at 2 in the morning. Another body had been found, this time in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. The victim was Marcus Webb, a youth pastor at Second Methodist Church. Marcus was 41 years old, married with 2 children of his own, and beloved by the teenagers he mentored. He had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. His body had been arranged carefully on the barn floor with his hands folded over his chest like he was lying in a coffin. Tucked into his shirt pocket was a note written in careful block letters: "The innocent will be avenged." Daniel arrived at the scene and immediately locked it down. He sent everyone away except Sarah and processed the evidence himself. He found what he expected to find: more photographs hidden in Marcus Webb's truck. These were even more disturbing than the ones found on Raymond Butler. They showed Marcus with children who trusted him, children whose parents had sent them to church camp and youth group events believing their kids would be safe. The second murder changed everything. The town could not ignore 2 deaths in 3 weeks, especially when both victims were pillars of the religious community. Rumors started spreading immediately. People whispered that maybe Raymond and Marcus had been involved in something criminal together. Maybe they had been stealing from the churches. Maybe they had been having an affair. The speculation grew wild and creative. Daniel let it grow. Better for people to invent scandals about embezzlement or adultery than to stumble onto the truth about child abuse. But Daniel knew he could not keep the real story buried much longer. Whoever was killing these men was moving fast and would likely strike again soon. Daniel intensified his investigation. He cross-referenced Raymond's and Marcus's phone records and found they had been in regular contact with each other and with 3 other men: a high school football coach named Dale Hendricks, a pediatrician named Dr. James Morrison, and a man named Kevin Butler who was Raymond's younger brother. All 5 men belonged to the same hunting club and took annual trips together to a remote property in Kentucky. Daniel felt ice form in his stomach as the network revealed itself. A coach with access to teenage athletes, a doctor who examined children, a youth pastor who mentored vulnerable kids, a church deacon who ran Sunday school, and Raymond's brother who worked as a school bus driver. Daniel obtained search warrants for the hunting club property in Kentucky. He drove there himself with Sarah and a state police investigator he trusted. What they found in the cabin made Daniel wish he had never started this investigation. There were cameras, recording equipment, a dark room for developing photographs, and filing cabinets full of images documenting decades of abuse. The earliest photographs were dated from the late 1970s. The most recent were from just months before Raymond Butler's death. Generations of children had been victimized by this network. The scale of it was overwhelming and horrifying. Daniel called a meeting with the district attorney and the state police. He laid out everything he had discovered. The DA looked at the evidence and immediately understood the problem. Prosecuting this case properly would require interviewing hundreds of potential victims, many of whom were now adults living all over the country. It would require exposing decades of institutional failure by churches and schools that had missed or ignored signs of abuse. It would destroy families and tear the community apart. The trials would take years and cost millions, and even then, convictions were not guaranteed because much of the evidence was old and victims' memories were unreliable. The DA said they needed to proceed carefully and build an airtight case. But Daniel knew they did not have time to proceed carefully. Someone was already executing members of the network. 2 were dead. 3 remained alive. Daniel arranged for Dale Hendricks, Dr. Morrison, and Kevin Butler to be brought in for questioning. He did not arrest them. He did not have enough current evidence for that yet. He just wanted to watch them, to see if any of them would panic and reveal something useful. Dale, the coach, came in cocky and confident, certain that nothing could touch him. Dr. Morrison came in with his lawyer and refused to answer any questions. Kevin Butler never showed up at all. Daniel sent deputies to Kevin's house and found it empty. Kevin had run. His truck was gone, and his wife claimed she had no idea where he went. She said Kevin had left in the middle of the night 3 days ago, after receiving a phone call. He had not told her anything except that he needed to take care of something. Daniel put out an APB for Kevin's truck and started checking with family members and known associates. Nobody had seen him or heard from him. Kevin Butler had disappeared completely. 2 days later, a hiker found Kevin's truck abandoned on a logging road deep in the national forest. The driver's door was open, the keys were in the ignition, Kevin's wallet and cell phone were on the seat, but there was no sign of Kevin himself. A search team combed the area and found nothing. It was as if Kevin had simply vanished into the woods. Daniel knew what had really happened, though. Someone had taken Kevin. Someone had executed him just like Raymond and Marcus. And whoever that someone was, they had gotten much better at hiding bodies. Daniel sat in his office late at night studying the evidence board he had created. Photographs of the 5 men were arranged in a circle with lines connecting them showing their relationships. 2 had red X marks through their faces, indicating they were dead. 1 had a question mark, indicating Kevin was missing and presumed dead. 2 remained without marks, Dale Hendricks and Dr. Morrison. Daniel knew they would be next. The killer was working through the network systematically. He had to decide whether to warn Dale and the doctor, to offer them protection, or to let nature take its course and hope the killer would make a mistake that would reveal their identity. The moral weight of that decision pressed down on Daniel like a physical force. These men were monsters who had hurt children for decades. They deserved punishment. But Daniel was a sheriff. He had taken an oath to uphold the law and protect all citizens, even the guilty ones. If he did nothing and Dale or Dr. Morrison ended up dead, Daniel would be complicit in murder through inaction. But if he protected them and they escaped justice through legal technicalities, Daniel would be protecting child predators. There was no good choice. There was only choosing which kind of guilt he could live with. Daniel made his decision. He would not warn Dale or Dr. Morrison. He would not offer them protection, but he would watch them carefully, 24 hours a day, and when the killer came for them, Daniel would be there. He would stop the murder from happening and arrest both the killer and the intended victim. That way, justice would be served all around. The predators would face trial, and the vigilante would face consequences for taking the law into their own hands. It was the only solution that honored both Daniel's oath and his conscience.
Daniel assigned deputies to watch Dale Hendricks and Dr. Morrison in rotating shifts. The surveillance was discreet but constant. Wherever the 2 men went, deputies followed at a distance. Daniel told his team they were protecting witnesses in an ongoing investigation. He did not tell them the full truth about what those witnesses had done. Most of his deputies were young and had families. Daniel did not want them carrying the knowledge of what was in those photographs. That burden was heavy enough that Daniel felt it crushing him a little more each day. A week passed without incident. Dale Hendricks continued coaching football practice. Dr. Morrison continued seeing patients at his clinic. Both men seemed nervous, but not actively fleeing. Daniel wondered if they knew about Kevin's disappearance. He wondered if they understood they were next on someone's list. Then, on a Friday night, Dale Hendricks' shadow deputy lost him. Dale had been at a sports bar watching a college football game. He had gone to the bathroom and never came back out. The deputy checked the bathroom and found it empty. He searched the entire bar and the parking lot. Dale's truck was still there, but Dale himself had vanished. Daniel rushed to the scene and coordinated a search. They found the back exit from the bar that led to an alley. Someone could have picked Dale up there without being seen from the parking lot. Daniel knew this was it. The killer had taken Dale just like they had taken Kevin. Daniel put out an emergency broadcast and mobilized every available deputy. They had to find Dale before the killer finished the job. For the first time, Daniel had a realistic chance of catching the vigilante in the act. The search continued through the night. Deputies checked every abandoned building, every isolated property, every place where someone might take a victim to kill them in private. They found nothing. As dawn broke and Daniel felt exhaustion pulling at him, his phone rang. It was Sarah. She had found something. Daniel drove to the location Sarah had provided, an old church that had been abandoned for 20 years after its congregation merged with another parish. The building was falling apart, its roof partially collapsed and its windows broken. Sarah was waiting outside when Daniel arrived. Sarah led Daniel into the abandoned church through a side door that hung crooked on broken hinges. Inside, the building smelled of rot and mildew. Broken pews were scattered across the floor. The altar had been vandalized long ago by teenagers looking for trouble. But Sarah led Daniel past all of this to a door behind the altar that opened onto stairs leading down to the church basement. Daniel drew his weapon and descended carefully, using his flashlight to illuminate the darkness below. What he found in that basement would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dale Hendricks was alive, but barely. He was tied to a chair in the center of the basement, his face bruised and bloody. Someone had beaten him severely but carefully, inflicting maximum pain without causing death. Standing behind Dale with a gun pressed to the back of his head was someone Daniel had not expected to see. It was Thomas Webb, the 16-year-old son of Marcus Webb, the youth pastor who had been murdered 3 weeks earlier. Thomas looked nothing like the quiet teenager Daniel remembered seeing around town. His face was cold and hard with a rage that seemed too large for his young body to contain. Daniel raised his own weapon and told Thomas to put the gun down. Thomas did not move. He kept the gun pressed against Dale's head and told Daniel that he could not let these men continue hurting children the way they had hurt him. Thomas's voice cracked as he spoke, revealing that beneath the cold rage was a terrified child trying to be brave. Daniel lowered his weapon slightly and asked Thomas to explain. Thomas said his father Marcus had been abusing him since he was 7 years old. At first, Thomas had thought he was the only victim, that there was something wrong with him specifically that made his father do those things. But then Thomas had discovered the photographs hidden in his father's office at the church. He had seen dozens of other children. He had recognized some of their faces. Kids from youth group, kids from church camp, kids he had grown up with. Thomas said he had not known what to do with this information at first. He had considered going to the police, but his father was respected in the community, and Thomas feared no one would believe him. He had considered telling his mother, but she idolized Marcus, and Thomas could not bear to destroy her world. So Thomas had done nothing for almost a year, carrying the weight of knowing his father was a monster. Then Thomas had found more photographs hidden in a different location. These photographs showed not just his father, but other men too. Raymond Butler, Dale Hendricks, Dr. Morrison, and Kevin Butler. Thomas realized his father was part of a network. Realizing this had changed everything for Thomas. If he exposed just his father, the others would scatter and disappear. But if he eliminated them all systematically, then no one would be left to hurt more children. Thomas started with Raymond because Raymond was the oldest, and Thomas feared he might die of natural causes before facing justice. Thomas had confronted Raymond in Mercy Hollow and told him he knew everything. Raymond had tried to apologize, had claimed he was sick and could not help himself, had begged Thomas not to tell anyone. Thomas put a rope around Thomas's neck and hung him from a tree. Thomas said he had felt nothing doing it. No guilt, no satisfaction, just cold determination to complete the task. Then Thomas had gone after his own father. Marcus was harder to kill because Thomas still loved him despite everything. But Thomas had done it anyway because he knew his father would never stop on his own. Daniel listened to this confession with a mixture of horror and sadness. Thomas was a child who had been so badly damaged by abuse that he had become a killer. Everything Thomas had done was illegal and wrong, but Daniel understood the rage that had driven Thomas to it. Daniel had felt the same rage looking at those photographs. The difference was that Daniel had experience and training that taught him to channel that rage into legal action. Thomas had only his pain and his youth and his desperate need to protect other children from the fate he had suffered.
Daniel told Thomas that what had been done to him was evil and unforgivable, but killing these men would not heal Thomas or undo the damage. It would only add more darkness to Thomas's life. Thomas said he did not care about his own life anymore. He had already decided he would kill himself after finishing off the last two members of the network. Thomas planned to make it look like Dale Hendricks had killed him, which would ensure Dale was arrested and exposed even if Thomas failed to execute him first. It was a suicide plan from the start. Thomas had never intended to survive his revenge. This revelation made Daniel's heart break. Thomas was 16 years old and so broken by abuse that he saw death as his only path forward. Daniel had to convince Thomas there were other options, that life could still hold meaning and peace even after terrible trauma. Daniel told Thomas about his own brother Tommy, who had died in Vietnam when Daniel was 13. Daniel explained how Tommy's death had nearly destroyed their family and how it had taken years to recover. Daniel said that if Thomas killed himself, his mother would be destroyed. She had already lost her husband. Losing her son too would likely kill her. Thomas responded that his mother would be better off without him anyway. She would mourn for a while, but eventually move on. At least she would be safe from the truth about what Marcus had done. Daniel said that was not how grief worked. The loss of a child was a wound that never truly healed. Thomas's mother deserved a chance to help her son heal rather than having to bury him. Dale Hendricks had been silent during this exchange, perhaps hoping that if he stayed quiet, both Daniel and Thomas would forget he was there. But now Dale made a mistake. He started to plead for his life. He told Thomas that he was sorry, that he had been sick, that he would turn himself in and confess everything if Thomas just let him live. Thomas pressed the gun harder against Dale's head and told him to shut up. Daniel saw Thomas's finger tightening on the trigger and knew he had seconds to act. Daniel did something he had never done in 28 years as sheriff. He lowered his weapon completely and holstered it. Then he told Thomas that if Thomas was determined to kill Dale, Daniel would not stop him. But first, Daniel wanted Thomas to understand what would happen next. Daniel explained that if Thomas pulled that trigger, Dale would die, but so would any chance of bringing the full network to justice. Dr. Morrison was still alive and would disappear the moment he heard about Dale's death. The evidence Daniel had gathered might not be enough to convict Morrison without testimony from other network members. That meant Morrison could escape punishment entirely and potentially continue hurting children in a different location. But if Dale was arrested alive, he could be pressured to testify against Morrison. Dale could provide details about how the network operated, who else might be involved in other towns, how they had avoided detection for so long. Dale's testimony could bring down not just Morrison, but potentially dozens of other predators across multiple states. Thomas listened to this argument, and Daniel could see the conflict playing across the boy's face. Thomas wanted Dale dead. Thomas wanted all of them dead. But Thomas also wanted to protect other children from suffering as he had suffered. If keeping Dale alive meant stopping more predators, then Thomas had to consider it. Daniel pressed his advantage. He told Thomas that the adult world would see Thomas as a victim rather than a criminal. Thomas was a minor who had been abused for years. Any decent defense attorney could argue temporary insanity or extreme emotional disturbance. Thomas might not serve any prison time at all if he cooperated and testified against the surviving network members. But if Thomas killed Dale now, Thomas would be a murderer and would spend his adult life in prison even if people understood his motivations. The gun in Thomas's hand began to shake. Thomas was breaking down, the cold rage that had sustained him through 2 murders finally cracking under the weight of what Daniel was saying. Thomas started to cry, and the gun dropped slightly away from Dale's head. Daniel took a careful step forward and spoke softly to Thomas. Daniel said Thomas was brave and strong and had tried to protect people when the adult in his life had failed him. But Thomas was still a child and should not have to carry this burden. Daniel promised that if Thomas put the gun down, Daniel would make sure every single person who hurt Thomas faced consequences. Daniel swore on his own brother's memory that justice would be done properly this time. Thomas lowered the gun completely and let it fall from his hand to the floor. Then he collapsed forward, his body racked with sobs. Daniel moved quickly to secure Dale while Sarah came forward to comfort Thomas. Daniel called for backup and an ambulance. Dale was arrested on the spot for child abuse. Daniel read him his rights and told him that his only chance of avoiding death row was to cooperate fully with the investigation and provide evidence against everyone else involved. Dale, terrified and in pain from the beating Thomas had given him, agreed immediately to cooperate right away. The next few weeks were a nightmare of investigation and revelation. With Dale's testimony and the evidence from the Kentucky hunting cabin, prosecutors built a case against Dr. Morrison. They also discovered that the network had connections to similar groups in 3 other states. Federal authorities became involved and launched a massive investigation. Kevin Butler's body was eventually found buried in the National Forest. Thomas admitted he killed Kevin, but claimed it was self-defense after Kevin attacked him during a confrontation. Given Thomas's age and history of victimization, prosecutors decided not to charge him with Kevin's death. They did charge him with the murders of Raymond Butler and Marcus Webb, but as Daniel had predicted, the charges were reduced significantly in exchange for Thomas's testimony. The trials took 3 years. Dale Hendricks was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dr. Morrison was also convicted and died in prison of a heart attack before completing his first year of his sentence. Federal prosecutors secured convictions against 7 other men in different states who had been part of the extended network. Dozens of victims came forward to testify. Some were adults who had been abused as children decades ago. Others were current minors who were suffering in silence. The scope of the abuse was so extensive that it made national news. Harlan's Ridge became infamous as the town that had harbored a child abuse ring for nearly 30 years.
The town itself was devastated. Many families discovered their children had been victims. Churches closed because attendance plummeted as people lost faith in institutions that had protected predators. The schools implemented new safety protocols but could not undo decades of failure. Some families moved away entirely, unable to live in a place with such dark associations. Others stayed and tried to rebuild. Support groups formed for survivors. Counseling services expanded. The community slowly began the long process of healing, though everyone understood some wounds would never fully close. Thomas Webb received a sentence of 10 years in a juvenile facility with intensive therapy and counseling. He would be released at age 26 if he completed his treatment successfully. Daniel visited Thomas regularly during his incarceration. Thomas was getting help and slowly beginning to process the trauma he'd experienced. He told Daniel he regretted the murders and wished he had come forward sooner through proper channels. But Thomas also said he did not regret protecting other children by exposing the network. Daniel told Thomas that heroism and trauma often look the same from the outside, and that Thomas should not define himself by the worst moments of his life. Thomas had been a victim who fought back in the only way he knew how. That did not make the murders right, but it made them understandable. Daniel retired from his position as sheriff shortly after the trials concluded. 28 years had been enough. The investigation had aged him in ways that went beyond simple years. He looked older now, moved slower, smiled less. The weight of knowing what had happened in his town, under his watch, was almost too much to bear. Daniel felt he had failed as a sheriff by not detecting the network sooner. He wondered how many children might have been spared if he had been more observant or more suspicious of respected community members. These thoughts haunted him in quiet moments and kept him awake at night. Sarah Mitchell took over as sheriff when Daniel retired. She was young but had proven herself capable during the investigation. Sarah told Daniel he should not blame himself for what happened. The predators had been sophisticated in their deception and had the protection of institutional authority. They had operated for decades before Sarah was even born. No individual sheriff could have prevented all of it. But Sarah also told Daniel that the investigation had changed how she approached law enforcement. She would never again assume that respect and authority meant innocence. She would never again take someone's public reputation at face value. The lessons learned from the network would shape how she protected Harlan's Ridge going forward. Daniel moved to a small cabin outside of town where he could have privacy and quiet. He spent his days fishing and reading and trying to find peace. Thomas wrote him letters from the juvenile facility, updating Daniel on his progress in therapy. Daniel wrote back with encouragement and advice. In a strange way, Thomas had become like a grandson to Daniel. They had both been changed by the investigation and bound together by the knowledge of what they had experienced. Daniel hoped Thomas would emerge from incarceration ready to build a meaningful life. Daniel wanted at least one good thing to come from all the darkness. 3 years after the trials, Daniel received a call from Sarah. She said there had been another incident in a town 60 miles south of Harlan's Ridge. A school teacher had been found dead in circumstances suggesting vigilante justice. Police had discovered evidence that the teacher had been abusing students. Sarah said it reminded her of what happened with Thomas and the network. She wondered if there might be another victim turned vigilante operating in the region. Daniel said it was possible and even likely. Abuse was far more common than people wanted to believe, and sometimes victims became so damaged they saw violence as their only option. Sarah asked if Daniel would consult on the case. Daniel declined. He was retired and had no desire to dive back into that kind of darkness. But Daniel did think about that teacher's death and what it might mean. He thought about how many other Thomas Webbs might be out there, children who had been hurt so badly they became dangerous themselves. He thought about how the system had failed Thomas and countless others like him. He thought about whether Thomas's murders had ultimately been a good thing because they exposed the network and saved future victims, or whether they had been a terrible tragedy that could have been avoided if adults had been more vigilant. Daniel never reached a conclusion on this question. Both things seemed true at once. Daniel also thought about his own role in everything that had happened. He was the sheriff. He was responsible for protecting people. But he was also the one who convinced Thomas to put down the gun and trust the system. Daniel wondered sometimes if that had been the right choice. Thomas was now in a facility receiving treatment instead of dead by suicide or sitting in an adult prison. The network had been exposed and destroyed. More predators had been caught. But Thomas was still traumatized and would carry scars for the rest of his life. Would Thomas have been better off if Daniel had simply let him complete his revenge and then kill himself as planned? Or had Daniel saved Thomas from compounding one tragedy with another? These were the kinds of questions that kept Daniel awake at night in his cabin by the lake. There were no easy answers. There was only the messy reality of trying to do right in a world where evil existed and sometimes wore familiar faces. Daniel had done his best to serve justice while also showing mercy. He had tried to protect both the innocent and the guilty because that was what the law required. Whether he had succeeded or failed was not for him to judge. History would make that determination long after Daniel was gone.
5 years after the investigation concluded, Daniel received a phone call that brought everything rushing back. It was Thomas Webb calling from a halfway house where he was completing the final months of his sentence. Thomas was now 21 years old and would be released in 3 months with a clean record if he continued meeting the terms of his rehabilitation. Thomas asked if he could visit Daniel when he got out. He said he needed to talk to someone who understood what had happened and what it meant. Daniel agreed to the visit, though he felt apprehensive about seeing Thomas again after so many years. The letters had been one thing, carefully composed thoughts, written with time to consider each word. But a face-to-face conversation would be different and more difficult. Thomas arrived at Daniel's cabin on a cold November afternoon. He looked different than Daniel remembered. The angry, broken teenager was gone. In his place was a young man who carried himself with quiet dignity and visible sadness. Thomas had grown taller and filled out. His faith had lost the softness of youth and gained the hard edges of someone who had seen too much darkness too early. But his eyes were what struck Daniel most. They held a weariness that seemed ancient, despite Thomas's young age. These were eyes that had witnessed horrors and committed terrible acts, and somehow survived to tell the tale. They sat on Daniel's porch drinking coffee and talking about inconsequential things at first. Thomas described the therapy he had received in the facility and how it had helped him process his trauma. He talked about education classes he had taken and skills he had learned. He said he planned to move to a different state when he was released because staying in Appalachia held too many painful memories. Thomas wanted to start fresh, somewhere people did not know his story. He wanted to build an ordinary life, doing ordinary work, and maybe someday have a family of his own. Daniel told Thomas these were good goals and that he believed Thomas could achieve them if he stayed focused on healing rather than dwelling on the past. But then Thomas brought up the real reason for his visit. He said he had been thinking a lot about Dale Hendricks and Dr. Morrison and the other men in the network who had gone to prison. Thomas had learned that Dale was dying of cancer and would likely be dead within the year. Thomas felt conflicted about this news. Part of him was glad Dale would soon be gone, but another part of Thomas wondered if Dale's death in prison represented justice, or just another tragedy in a long chain of tragedies. Thomas asked Daniel how he thought about it, whether the punishment these men received had been sufficient or whether Thomas's original plan to kill them all might have been more just. Daniel thought carefully before answering. He told Thomas that justice and vengeance were different things, even though they sometimes look similar. Justice was about accountability and preventing future harm while respecting human dignity and the rule of law. Vengeance was about inflicting pain on those who had caused pain, with no regard for larger principles or consequences. Thomas's murders had been understandable given his trauma, but they had still been vengeance rather than justice. The trials and prison sentences that followed were justice, imperfect and inadequate perhaps, but still representing society's collective judgment about how to handle evil while maintaining moral authority. Thomas listened and then asked Daniel a harder question. He asked if Daniel had ever wanted to kill the men himself. Had Daniel ever looked at the evidence and thought that these monsters did not deserve a trial or mercy or even basic human rights? Daniel admitted that yes, he had felt that rage. When he first saw the photographs and understood the scope of the abuse, Daniel had fantasized about taking his service weapon and executing every man involved. But Daniel said he had not acted on those feelings because he understood that giving in to them would make him no different than the criminals he was supposed to be stopping. The whole point of law and civilization was to prevent people from acting on their worst impulses. Lawmen started executing people they deemed worthy of death, then there was no law anymore, only power and violence. Thomas considered this and said Daniel wished he had understood that distinction when he was 16. He said his therapist had helped him realize that his murders had been about trying to regain control after years of being powerless. By killing the men who hurt him, Thomas had been asserting power over them in a way he never could while being victimized. But Thomas now understood that this kind of power was hollow and destructive. Real power came from building things rather than destroying them, from helping people heal rather than making them hurt. Thomas said he wanted to use the rest of his life to build and heal, but he feared his past would always define him. People would always see him as a teenager who killed his father and others. Daniel told Thomas something he had learned over his long career in law enforcement. He said identity was not fixed, but fluid. People to change and grow and become something different than what they had been. Thomas at 21 was not the same person as Thomas at 16. The trauma and abuse had shaped Thomas, but did not have to define him forever. Thomas could choose what his life would mean going forward. The path would always be part of his story, but it did not have to be the whole story. Many people have overcome terrible beginnings to build meaningful lives. Thomas could do the same if he committed to it and got the support he needed.
They talked for hours that afternoon, discussing the case and its aftermath from angles they had never explored in their letters. Thomas told Daniel about other victims he had met during therapy groups, people who had been abused as children and were now trying to build adult lives while carrying that trauma. Thomas said some of them had developed addictions or mental health problems, or ended up in abusive relationships themselves. Others had become advocates and counselors, helping other survivors. A few had committed suicide, unable to bear the weight of their memories. Thomas said he had been lucky in some ways because his trauma had transformed into action rather than self-destruction. The murders had been terrible, but they had also given Thomas a sense of agency that many victims never experienced. Thomas felt guilty about this, that his path through trauma had somehow been easier than what others endured.
Daniel said there was no hierarchy of suffering and no right way to survive trauma. Every victim's experience was unique and valid. Thomas should not feel guilty for having found a way through his darkness, even if that way had involved violence. What mattered now was what Thomas did with his survival. Would he waste it on guilt and self-recrimination, or would he honor the struggle by building something positive with the years he had left? Daniel believed Thomas was capable of the latter, if he made that choice. Thomas had already shown remarkable strength by surviving what had been done to him and by cooperating with the prosecution, even though it meant reliving his trauma in court testimony. As the sun began to set over the mountains, Thomas asked Daniel one final question. He wanted to know if Daniel thought God could forgive someone like Thomas, someone who had killed his own father and 2 other men. Daniel was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said he was a Presbyterian and believed in a God of grace and redemption. The Bible was full of stories about terrible people who found forgiveness through genuine repentance. Moses was a murderer. David was an adulterer who arranged a murder to cover up his affair. Paul persecuted Christians before his conversion. All of them found forgiveness because they turned away from their sins and tried to live differently. Daniel said Thomas had done terrible things, but he had also been a child acting out of profound trauma. If Thomas genuinely repented and spent his life trying to do good, then Daniel believed God's grace was large enough to cover even Thomas's sins. Thomas cried when Daniel said this. He had been carrying guilt and shame for 5 years, wondering if he was beyond redemption. Hearing Daniel, someone he respected and trusted, say that forgiveness was possible meant everything to Thomas. They sat together in the growing darkness, and Thomas talked about his plans for the future. He wanted to work with troubled youth and help prevent others from experiencing what he had experienced. He wanted to speak publicly about his story as a warning about the long-term effects of abuse and the importance of reporting suspected cases. Thomas said if his story could save even one child from suffering as he had suffered, then maybe his life would have meaning beyond the murders. Daniel told Thomas his story was already saving children. The investigation that came from Thomas's murders had exposed a network that might have continued operating for decades more if left undiscovered. Dozens of victims had come forward and received help. New laws had been passed to strengthen protections for children. Training programs had been implemented for teachers, coaches, and clergy to recognize signs of abuse. The cultural conversation about child protection had shifted because of cases like this one. Thomas's actions were illegal and wrong, but they had also been the catalyst for real positive change. That paradox was uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it was true nonetheless. They said goodbye as night fell completely over the mountains. Thomas thanked Daniel for his wisdom and support over the years. He said he would write once he was settled in his new life, somewhere far from Appalachia. Daniel wished Thomas well and told him to be patient with himself as he healed. Recovery from trauma was not linear, and there would be setbacks. But Daniel believed Thomas had the strength and insight to build a good life if he stayed committed to doing so. They shook hands and Thomas drove away into the darkness, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts on the porch. Daniel sat there for a long time after Thomas left, thinking about everything that had happened. The investigation had been the defining event of Daniel's career, and in many ways of his entire life. It had changed how he understood his community and his role within it. Daniel had always believed that most people were fundamentally good and that evil was rare and obvious when it appeared. But the network had taught him that evil often wore respectable faces and hid behind institutional authority. The men who hurt children were not monsters from nightmares. They were coaches and doctors and pastors and deacons. They were neighbors and friends and pillars of the community. This realization had shaken Daniel's faith in his own judgment and in humanity generally. But the investigation had also shown Daniel something hopeful. It has shown him that even when institutions failed and authorities looked the other way, individuals could still act to expose wrongdoing and protect the innocent. Thomas had done this through violence, which was wrong, but Sarah Mitchell and the other deputies had done it through dedicated investigation. Victims who testified had done it through their courage in coming forward. Journalists who covered the trials had done it by keeping public attention focused on the case. There were many ways to fight evil, and most of them did not require violence or breaking laws. Daniel wished Thomas had known this at 16, but Daniel was grateful that Thomas knew it now.
If you enjoyed this story and want more stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me know you want more stories from this universe.